Using the CMF by Nothing Watch Pro has been one of the most frustrating experiences I've had in a while, and that's saying something given that I've tested dozens of smartwatches in the last year. Still, there are some things to like about this cheap $69 smartwatch, a watch that I expect many of you are considering as a cheap Apple Watch alternative. However, as you will see in this video, based on my systematic testing of this watch, I think that many of you will be disappointed with the performance of this first smartwatch of CMF by Nothing. At least that is if you care about the sports and health tracking of this watch. Outside that, the watch does look and feel quite premium for the price. However, you can judge yourself based on the data I'll share in this video. As always, to not waste your time, there are timestamps on the timeline. Let's get started. I was quite excited to test the Nothing Watch Pro and about two of them to be able to collect a lot of data quickly. However, after connecting them with two of my iPhones, I noticed the first big problem I had with the Nothing Watch Pro. None of the sports or sleep data was syncing with either of my iPhones. I could see the data on the watch, but it just wasn't there on the phone. Now, I chose an iPhone since I was hoping to sync my data with Apple Health, but not only was this not happening, the data itself was not even showing on the Nothing Watch app itself. I tried a bunch of things and I even contacted their help desk. I tried all their tips, but this didn't help, and they even suggested to go to an offline CMF service center. They didn't provide me with an address, but the closest one I could find would make for quite an interesting journey if I would take the shortest route. So instead of that, I just decided to switch to Android, which seemed to solve the issue, which means they likely just messed up something in their iPhone app since both iPhones had the exact same problem. Okay, so now I could see my data in the Nothing Watch app, but this is where I encountered the next issue. I could find no way to actually get to my data. The data is locked up within the app and I could not connect it to any fitness app like for instance Strava. So just be aware that if you use a Nothing Watch, at least at the moment, your data seems to be locked up in the CMF Watch app. It will be on a server somewhere and it's unclear to me in which country the data is actually stored, and there's no way I could get to the data at least. But maybe you're okay with that and you just want to see your sleep measurements and heart rate measurements inside the app. But is this any good? Well, as regular viewers know, I would normally export the data and compare it to a reference device. But as I said, I couldn't get to the data. I could just see the graphs in the app. So I had to spend hours manually extracting the data from screenshots of the app using Webplot Digitizer and other tools. But I did it. I spent hours just so you can see if this $69 watch can track your heart rate and sleep. By the way, for those of you that are new to the channel, my name is Rob and I'm a postdoctoral scientist specializing in biological data analysis. So is the CMF Watch Pro any good? You can judge for yourself. And we will start by looking at the heart rate tracking performance of the CMF Watch Pro during indoor cycling, which is a relatively easy exercise for a watch to track given the limited movement and lack of tension on my arm. And here you can see an overview of the results. Now, to test the performance, I'll compare the heart rate measurements of the CMF Watch Pro against the Polar H10 ECG chest strap, which can generally record my heart rate very accurately. Now, each dot here is a single heart rate measurement, with along the horizontal axis the value according to the Polar H10 ECG chest strap, and on the vertical axis the value according to the CMF Watch Pro. Now, the closer the points are to the blue line, the better the agreement, and the darker black the color, the more dots that there are. And as you can see, the agreement is not great, I would say. There are quite a few points still close to the blue line, both here in the lower heart rate range and in the higher heart rate range. But especially in the higher heart rate range, there are some points below the blue line, indicating that sometimes they detected a too low heart rate. Also, the correlation, this R value up here, is not very good at 0.53. Now, the correlation can have a maximum value of 1.00, so a correlation of 0.53 isn't that great. But because I couldn't export the data directly, it's really important to take a look at the individual rides here. There might be some small time shifts due to the fitting that aren't indicative of poor performance, but more a limitation of the data fitting. And here you can see the first example interval spinning session I wanted to share with you. Now, in all honesty, I just exported or fitted data for two of them because this was a lot of work. I recorded data for many more, but I just couldn't get to that data. And this is what I could get in the end in the time I had to spend on it. But I think these two sessions are enough to tell us what's going on here. Now, along the horizontal axis, we have the time, and my heart rate is along the vertical axis. In blue-green, I plotted my heart rate according to the Polar H10 ECG chest strap, and in red is my heart rate according to the CMF Watch Pro. And for this ride, it seems there's a somewhat okay fit, but some of the peaks in my heart rate are missed. There's also a slight time warp in the signal just because the fit I could get wasn't perfect from the graph in the app, but still we can clearly see what's going on. Here in the beginning, it missed some of the peaks in my heart rate, also right here for this part of the segment and this part of the segment, the peak in my heart rate was missed, and for about half, maybe just over half the training, it was able to detect my peaks in heart rate. So not good, but also not the absolute worst I've seen. And this second training session actually looks a bit better. Here we can see even more that there's some time shift potentially going on just because of the way I had to fit the data. But overall here, it does seem to be able to catch most of the peaks in my heart rate, except for here. So you should just imagine it shifting a little bit so it overlaps better. So that correlation value we were looking at before might also be a slight underestimation of the true correlation, but still we can see there are some issues. So for instance, right here, it misses a dip at part of my heart rate. And also here, it takes some more time to detect an increase in my heart rate. But this definitely looked better than the first spinning session. So yeah, not the best performance, but let's quickly put these results into context. And we will do that by comparing the performance of the CMF Watch Pro to that of many other devices I've tested in the past. And that overview is displayed right here. Again, this is not a completely fair comparison because for the other watches I was able to get a good data extraction, whereas for the Nothing Watch Pro it's a bit noisy, so in reality the correlation might be a bit higher. So take it with a grain of salt, but this does allow you to see which watches were good and where we would roughly expect the Nothing Watch Pro to be. Now the correlation value I was talking about before is the metric we'll use for comparison, which is displayed along the horizontal axis here, and we want that value to be as close to 1 as possible. And on the vertical axis I ordered the watches from worst to best. So the further to the right and the higher the device is, the better is its correlation with the reference device. And here I marked the CMF Watch Pro in red. And as you can see, it's really amongst the worst performing watches. As I said, it might do a bit better in reality, but I wouldn't expect it to be any higher than maybe 0.65, 0.7. So it would always be amongst the poorer performing watches. It would not be a watch I would recommend in this case. Now, if you're curious which are the best performing watches, we need to zoom in a bit. So here I zoomed in to just the watches with a correlation of 0.9 or higher. And there's many watches to choose from in this range. There are some cheaper Fitbit devices which are doing quite okay, like the Fitbit Inspire 3. Galaxy watches and some older Huawei devices aren't doing too shabby as well. There's the Whoop Strap 4.0. But if we just focus on some of the best performing watches, we see that some newer Huawei devices are doing quite well, but also the Fitbit Charge 6 and the Google Pixel Watch and Google Pixel Watch 2 are doing quite okay, and the best are still Apple Watches. So basically any Apple Watch will perform really well during indoor cycling. Okay, this honestly doesn't bode too well for the Nothing Watch Pro, but it could be worse, I guess. Brief pause to the video just to avoid confusion. While I'm editing, I'm realizing I'm using CMF Watch and Nothing Watch Pro interchangeably, but this refers to the same watch, so the CMF by Nothing Watch Pro. We need to look at more types of exercises to make a complete judgment. So let's now take a look at the next most difficult exercise for a watch to track, running outside. Now, running outside increases the bumpiness during the exercise. However, there's still little tension on my arm and wrist, making it only slightly harder for it to get a clean heart rate signal, though there is an additional problem with running. Let's see how the Nothing Watch Pro did. Now, this is a similar overview to before, but now for running. And again, we want those points to be as close to the blue line as possible. And as you can see, most of the points are above the blue line. So my heart rate was generally between maybe 130 and 160 BPM. But the CMF Nothing Watch Pro detected a heart rate between 150 and 180 BPM. Now, I have some suspicion about what is happening, but let's take a look at the individual ride before we make that judgment. Also, the correlation isn't great again at 0.55, so comparable to what we saw for indoor cycling. But let's take a look at the individual run. In the end, I was only able to get the data for one of the runs that I did, but I did plenty more. But we can clearly see what the issue is. Most of the time, the Nothing Watch Pro in red detects a much too high heart rate. Only on the few moments where I took a short break, for instance right here, and right here, does it seem to be able to get back to my normal real heart rate. And I think I know what's going on here. The Nothing Watch Pro seems to detect a heart rate of about 160 to 170 BPM most of the time, while in reality, at least according to the ECG chest strap, my heart rate was just under 150 BPM. And this is due to a phenomenon known as cadence lock, where there's noise in the heart rate signal because the watch is measuring the movement of your wrists or the steps you're taking instead of the actual heart rate. And luckily, I also measured my cadence during this same run using one of those Garmin running pods. And as you can see, unsurprisingly, I would say, my cadence was roughly between 160 and 170 SPM. So instead of measuring my heart rate, most likely the Nothing Watch Pro was measuring my cadence instead. Many newer generation watches have learned to deal with this, but the Nothing Watch Pro doesn't seem to be able to handle this. And here we have a similar overview to before, but now for running, with again the Nothing Watch Pro marked in red. And as you can see, the Nothing Watch Pro is really amongst the poorer performing watches. It could have been affected again because I couldn't get a clean data export, but because the heart rate was always too high, I really wouldn't rely on the Nothing Watch Pro for running. In this case, the Coral Space 3, Pixel Watch, and especially Apple Watches are doing really well for running. Next, let's take a look at an even more difficult exercise for a watch to track, cycling outside. Now, this doesn't so much have a problem like cadence lock, but the issue here is there's a lot more bumpiness and also much more tension on my arms because I'm holding onto the handlebars. So let's see how the CMF Nothing Watch Pro performed for outdoor cycling. However, first a quick side note. If you're interested in the latest updates on the wearables I'm testing, I'm planning to start back up with my newsletter and posting more off-the-cuff things on my Instagram and my YouTube Shorts channel. So if you're interested in any of those are linked below. Also, I'm trying to become part of the first people who receive watches to review from companies like Garmin and Samsung. And if you want to help me make faster and better reviews, it would really help if you like, subscribe and or comment. But of course, this is totally up to you. Now, enough self-promotion, let's get back to testing the CMF Watch Pro. Again, a similar overview, but now for cycling outside. And as you can see, this really doesn't look good. There are some points close to the blue line, but almost all of them are underneath the blue line, indicating that most of the time the Nothing Watch Pro detected a too low heart rate. The correlation is also really bad at 0.15. This is some of the worst I've ever seen. But okay, let's take a look at the individual rides to see what is happening here. And here we have the first example bike ride with again the reference in blue-green and the CMF Watch Pro in red. And as you can see, the CMF Watch Pro just keeps detecting a too low heart rate. Most of the time it detects a heart rate between, let's say, 60 and 80 BPM, whereas in reality my heart rate is much higher. So it's really struggling with the tension on my arm and the bumpiness. And we see more or less the same thing for this second bike ride, where it keeps detecting a too low heart rate. Only right here does it seem to want to increase the heart rate, but then it drops back down. And also during the other segments, the heart rate is just too low. And finally, we see the exact same thing for this last bike ride. It keeps detecting a too low heart rate, almost always between 110 BPM, whereas in reality, most of the time my heart rate was above 110 BPM. So really not a good watch for cycling. And again, to put it into perspective, here's an overview of the different watches I've tested. And the Nothing Watch Pro marked in red is really not doing well. We saw it always keeps detecting a too low heart rate, and you have many better devices to choose from. There are some okay performing watches like different Garmin devices that are doing quite well. The Garmin Venue 3, for instance, is not too bad. But let's zoom in a bit so we can actually read those labels. So these are just the watches with a correlation of 0.7 or higher. So we saw some Garmin devices, Whoop straps, some cheaper Fitbit devices aren't too bad. But really amongst the top performing watches, we see the Google Pixel Watch and Pixel Watch 2 especially, but also Apple Watches and different Huawei devices. Surprisingly, the Fitbit Charge 6 has really improved a lot compared to the Fitbit Charge 5, so the previous generation. There were some algorithmic updates that really seem to have improved the performance, but I'm working on an updated video on the Fitbit Charge 6 and the Pixel Watch 2 so you can get a more complete overview. Still, I think any of these devices above 0.9 or higher are pretty good choices for cycling outside. So for biking, the Nothing Watch Pro seems to be more or less useless. It just keeps detecting my baseline heart rate no matter what, and it never really detects an increase in my heart rate. Now finally, let's take a look at the performance of the Nothing Watch Pro during weightlifting. Now weightlifting is generally the exercise that watchers struggle with most because there's so much tension on my arm. Let's take a look. Again, here we have a similar overview, but now for weightlifting, and the correlation is again in the same range as what we saw for biking indoors and running at 0.46. It's a little bit lower, but roughly in the same range. The correlation just isn't very good. In the lower heart rate range, it might be a little bit better right here, but especially in the higher heart rate range, all points are below the blue line, indicating it detected a too low heart rate. But again, let's take a look at the individual training sessions. And here we see the overview for the first weightlifting session, where each time I did a set of exercises, my heart rate increased, as you can see in blue-green. And most of the time, the Nothing Watch Pro isn't able to detect this. Sometimes it has a partial pickup on the peak, so the beginning of each set, but it almost never detects the full peak in my heart rate. It might have done it here and potentially here, but it's just not doing very well. And that's also what we see for this second weightlifting session. Again, I have a lot of peaks in heart rate and none of them are detected by the Nothing Watch Pro. And again, by now you know what this kind of overview looks like, and we see the Nothing Watch Pro isn't doing very well. It's not even in the mediocre types of watches, it's really amongst the poorer performing watches. And this is really because it cannot pick up on those peaks in my heart rate, though again it might suffer a little bit from the type of data export I had to do. If we zoom into the better performing watches, so just those with a correlation of 0.7 or higher, we get this overview, where in reality, I would only focus on those watches with a correlation of 0.9, preferably 0.95 or higher, as the ones I would use for weightlifting. And if you really want the best performance during weightlifting, just use an ECG chest strap. That's the only way to consistently get a reliable heart rate measurement for weightlifting. But again, the Nothing Watch Pro is really not a watch I would choose for heart rate tracking, also not during weightlifting. So for weightlifting, the Nothing Watch Pro doesn't appear to be very good. It can detect the peaks in my heart rate partially sometimes, but it was never able to fully detect my peaks in heart rate, and quite often it missed them completely. Overall, the heart rate tracking performance of the Nothing Watch Pro is quite poor, I would say. Combine that with a closed ecosystem where you cannot get to your data and you cannot connect it to something like Strava, and you have a watch I cannot recommend at all for heart rate tracking. I would therefore give the heart rate tracking performance of the CMF by Nothing Watch Pro 1 out of 5 stars. Okay, but maybe it's not the heart rate tracking you're interested in, but you want to know more about your sleep and track your sleep stages. Is this any good on the CMF Watch Pro? Well, to test the sleep stage tracking performance, I'll compare the Nothing Watch Pro to the Z-Max EEG headband, which can actually measure my brain waves. This device has its limitations, especially when it comes to detecting awake time. I've discussed this in several of my videos, so I won't go into details here, but what it boils down to is it'll mostly ignore the awake time detection in the analysis and focus on deep sleep, light sleep, and REM sleep. Again, I couldn't get to the raw data, so I had to manually take screenshots and from that estimate when each sleep stage started. And these are the screenshots from the Nothing app that I combined into a single file for 9 nights. Now, the ones I will actually analyze are indicated here by an asterisk, so these are converted to actual data. But there's one thing right here looking at these sleep stage patterns that already has me worried, namely that they look scarily consistent both within the night and between the nights. Yes, it's definitely true that you go through sleep cycles which have somewhat repeating patterns, but there should generally be relatively little REM sleep earlier in the night and less deep sleep later in the night. However, the sleep patterns of the Nothing Watch Pro early in the night are not that different from the ones later in the night, and also each night starts with REM sleep actually, which is not a normal sleep pattern. I somewhat fear that they hard-coded the sleep staging to have this consistent pattern of REM sleep, light sleep, deep sleep, light sleep, REM sleep, and so on. So each repeating pattern, starting with REM sleep, going through light, deep, light, REM, with some awake moments in between. Yes, there are a few moments where this doesn't happen, for instance right here and right here as well, but generally this looks super consistent and each night starts with REM sleep, and this is really not what it's supposed to look like. But okay, let's actually evaluate the performance more objectively. And here you can see an overview of the sleep test results, with on top the sleep stages according to the Z-Max EEG device, and on the left the sleep stages as recorded by the CMF Watch Pro. Now each column here sums to 100%, meaning that we can see what percentage of each of the sleep stages according to the Z-Max was predicted as each sleep stage by the CMF Watch Pro. And if they perfectly agree, all values on the diagonal should be 100%. Now first of all, we see that about 70% of what was deep sleep according to the Z-Max was also predicted as deep sleep by the CMF Watch Pro, which sounds pretty good, but the CMF Watch Pro does predict way too much deep sleep. You can see that in these percentages on top right here. So a lot of what was light sleep is also predicted as deep sleep. REM sleep is also often predicted as deep sleep. And the same goes for awake time, though again, we will not focus on this too much. And if the Nothing Watch Pro does predict what the EEG device said was deep sleep as something else, it's mostly is light sleep. Now looking at the individual nights will help us understand that even better, and here we can see the first night I wanted to share with you. On top we have the sleep stages according to the ZMax EEG headband, with along the horizontal axis the clock time and my sleep stages on the vertical axis, and on the bottom we have a similar plot but now for the CMF Watch Pro. Now in purple here I highlighted the deep sleep as recorded by the ZMax EEG device, and as you can see there's an okay agreement with the Nothing Watch Pro. This first deep sleep segment agrees okay, I would say. These later ones are shifted a bit, so the Nothing Watch Pro detected them later, and also they last longer, and a lot more deep sleep is also detected later on in the night. And we see more or less the same thing for this second night. So this deep sleep segment, the first one, agrees quite well, but then for the later ones it detects more deep sleep and also detects a lot of deep sleep later on in the night. So I would say that most likely the Nothing Watch Pro overestimates my deep sleep. Now light sleep agreement is okay-ish at about 58%, but there is a lot of confusion. Quite a bit is actually predicted as either deep sleep as we saw before or as REM sleep. So 58% agreement, 57% is not that great. And REM sleep agreement by far is the worst at about 28%. So only 28% of what the EEG device predicted as being REM sleep is also predicted as REM sleep by the Nothing Watch Pro. More of it is instead predicted as light sleep at about 46%. So that's not very good. And as I said before, even a significant percentage is predicted as deep sleep instead. Now again, looking at the individual nights will help us understand it even better. But now I highlighted the REM sleep as detected by the EEG device in red. And as you can see, there's a marginal agreement between the Nothing Watch Pro and the ZMax EEG device at best. There's some REM sleep that shows overlap, for instance right here, where here in red we have the REM sleep according to the Nothing Watch Pro, and the highlighted red part is the REM sleep according to the EEG device. Also right here and right here there's some overlap, but earlier in the night there's very little overlap, and also right here it already detected me as being awake fully. Now this second night looks a bit better, I would say. So the location of this first very short REM sleep segment according to the EEG device does match the Nothing Watch Pro, and the second, third and fourth segment also match very well. Only this later REM sleep right here didn't match very well between the EEG device and the Nothing Watch Pro. Overall, I still get the impression that the Nothing Watch Pro has these pre-programmed cycles that it just tries to follow. Now, we'll not focus on awake time too much because the ZMax detects a lot of these short awakenings, but generally the awake time agreement doesn't appear to be that great. In general, I found that the Nothing Watch Pro isn't very sensitive and doesn't tend to detect a lot of awake moments. Now, as I said, I don't want to focus on awake moments because the ZMax tends to detect a lot of these short awake moments that aren't really that relevant for what we're looking at. But as you can see, the longer awake moments do generally tend to match between the EEG device and the Nothing Watch Pro. So there was a longer awake moment right here, which also was detected by the Nothing Watch Pro. The same goes for a shorter awake moment right here, which matches the Nothing Watch Pro. But then later on, there's some disagreement right here where the Nothing Watch Pro said I was fully awake, but the ZMax EEG device only detected some shorter awake moments. And for this second night, we see more or less the same thing. So some longer awake moments according to the EEG device are also detected by the Nothing Watch Pro. And later on, there's some marginal agreement again near the end of the night. But as I said, there's a lot of these short awake moments according to the EEG device that are probably overestimated. So I wouldn't focus on this. So the sleep stage tracking performance of the Nothing Watch Pro isn't great. I suspect that they just programmed some prior expected patterns of the sleep stages and adapted slightly based on your movement and heart rate data, but that's just my guess. I personally wouldn't use it to track my sleep stages, but let's put these results into context by comparing them against many of the other watches I've tested in the past. Now this graph right here shows you an overview of the agreement of different watches with different reference devices. Along the horizontal axis, we have the average agreement over the individual sleep stages, and on the vertical axis, we have the agreement of the worst sleep stage. Now, the better the agreement, the more to the top right the device is. Now, this overview is indeed slightly complicated because I use different reference devices. The devices not marked in any color were tested against the Dream 2 EEG headband, which was discontinued, so I cannot use it anymore. The devices marked in blue-purple were tested against polysomnography, so the gold standard in sleep stage tracking, and the devices marked in green were tested against the ZMax EEG headband, the one we use in this video. And the CMF Watch Pro is right here, so it's really amongst the poorer performing watches. It's not the absolute worst as for instance the Mi Band 8, but it's somewhere in the range of different Huawei devices and Amazfit devices, so not very good. I just wouldn't trust the sleep stage tracking of the CMF Watch Pro. Some of the better devices are all the way up here, especially Apple Watches are very good at sleep stage tracking, at least on me. Also the Nuko app is quite good but not available everywhere yet. I really like the H-Sleep Pod 3, but this is really expensive. But if you want to go a bit cheaper, different Fitbit devices are also quite good at sleep stage tracking. Maybe not quite as good as the Apple Watches, but still quite decent. Also, Oura rings have good sleep stage tracking. Other options include the Whoop strap, which is also quite decent. Also not quite as good as the Apple Watch, but pretty good. It's an overall good fitness and sleep tracker. And other Google products are also good. So Google owns Fitbit now, and I suspect that different Google and Fitbit devices use the exact same algorithm. So if you want to go really cheap, just get the cheapest Fitbit device you can find and you get decent sleep stage tracking. But getting back to the CMF Watch Pro, I just wouldn't rely on it for sleep stage tracking. So the sleep stage tracking of the Nothing Watch Pro just isn't very good, at least in my opinion. I wouldn't use it to tell me anything useful about my sleep stages, except perhaps my total time spent in bed. So if you want anything more complicated than that, just pick another watch. Overall, I'd give the sleep stage tracking performance of the Nothing Watch Pro 2 out of 5 stars. So as you might have guessed by now, with the current firmware and app, I'm not very happy with the CMF Watch Pro. First of all, my data is locked inside an ecosystem with a poorly performing app. And second, the health and sports data it provides just doesn't appear to be very accurate on me. That being said, more subjectively, I do like the design and simplicity of the CMF Watch Pro. And for the price, it does feel surprisingly premium. It's kind of chunky, which means it does look quite big on smaller wrists. So if you don't care at all about the health and sports tracking, this watch might still be for you. But if you do care about it, I would steer clear. Therefore, overall, I'd give the health and sports tracking of the Nothing Watch Pro 1.5 out of 5 stars. Now, one thing we didn't discuss yet is the GPS tracking accuracy. And that's because this is again a type of data you can just see within the app. Now, looking at the individual tracks, it doesn't seem that bad since the signal appears to follow the roads quite well and the signal doesn't seem very noisy. It's difficult to say anything definitive though, since I cannot overlay the tracks. I also suspect they are doing some kind of smoothing to the signal in post-processing, since sometimes the signal will smoothly go through some buildings. But this is about all I can say about it. Of course, it's important to mention that there's limitations to my testing, which include me not being able to export the data directly and only testing the watches on me, and it might perform differently on you. Still, I feel quite confident in saying that the health and sports tracking just wasn't very good, and it doesn't seem to have been a priority when designing it. Of course, check out some other reviews as well to see if they reach different conclusions. If you do decide to get a Nothing Watch Pro, an Apple Watch, an H-Sleep Pod 3, a Whoop strap, an Oura ring, another device, or anything at all on Amazon for that matter, even something as small as toilet paper, want to potentially save some money and at the same time support the channel, there are different affiliate and non-affiliate links in the description below. They do not cost you any extra, and some even provide a discount. Also, given that you watched this whole video on the Nothing Watch Pro, check out this video on the Huawei Band 8, which I think is a better alternative to the Nothing Watch Pro. Thank you so much for watching and catch you in the next video.